Welcome to the APTA October Advocacy Update. Hi, I'm Justin Elliott, Vice President of Government Affairs. Today, we're going to take a look at the upcoming fall midterm elections, the 2023 Medicare Fee Schedule, and some of the bills that are still in play in the U.S. Congress. So to kick us off, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Matlack, APTA's Director of Grassroots and Political Affairs. Mike?
Thank you, Justin. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the fall election that's coming up in about a month, and also what impact that might have on the committees of jurisdiction regarding healthcare issues. Generally, in regards to the off elections, usually what happens is the party that is not in control of the White House loses seats. So that means that Republicans have a better chance of gaining seats both in the House and Senate. So let's look at the Senate. There's 10 competitive Senate races currently. Democrats currently hold Arizona, Colorado, Georgia, New Hampshire, Nevada. Republicans hold competitive seats of Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. As you can see, there's 5 seats on both sides. Republicans only need 1 seat gain to control the Senate. And most political operatives believe that Georgia and Nevada on the Democrat side are most likely to change hands, while on the Republican side, Pennsylvania is more likely to change. If that did occur, then Republicans would gain control of the Senate. But as you can see, there's many seats up for grabs right now, so anything can happen. In regards how that could impact the committees of jurisdiction, the Senate Finance Committee has a current ratio of 14 Republicans and 14 Democrats. Regardless of what happens in the election, 4 Republicans are currently going to be retiring from the Finance Committee. Senator Burr from North Carolina, Senator Portman from Ohio, Senator Toomey of Pennsylvania, and recently Senator Sass in Nebraska will be retiring and has no impact in regards to election. So there's going to be as many as 4 or maybe 5 or 6 new Republicans on that committee if Republicans take control of the Senate. Also, you would have a new chairman. Senator Mike Crapo of Idaho will become the new chairman of that committee. He's a Republican from Idaho, so more likely he's going to be looking at how rural health care is treated on that committee, and also in regards to administrative burden and how things can be more effectively used in regards to health care. On the Senate Health Committee, there also would be a new chair. Most likely, Senator Richard Burr, who's retiring. If Republicans took control of the Senate, Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky would be the new chairman of that committee. And like I said before, on the Health Committee, there's not going to be many changes in regards to the election. And the only person on that committee that might lose their election is Senator Hassan of New Hampshire. But that committee doesn't have as many changes as the Finance Committee. Also, there would be new leadership in the Senate. Senator McConnell and Thune would be the new Republican leaders, and Senator Schumer and Durbin, who are the current leaders of the Senate, would be now in the minority. Like I said, anything could happen. If you talk to most prognosticators, they believe that it's a 50-50 chance of Democrats holding control of the Senate and Republicans taking control. So anything can happen, but there's many seats up for grabs at this moment. Now let's look at the House. In regards to the House, only 5 seats need to change hands for Republicans to regain control of the House. Because of redistricting, there are already 10 Democratic seats in the lean, likely Republican compared to 3 Republican seats. As you can see, just from that one fact, that there is a likelihood Republicans would take control of the House. There's also 22 Democratic-held toss-up seats compared to 9 Republican. In addition, there are 27 Democratic seats to 14 Republican seats that are considered competitive. As you can see, these numbers do not look good for Democrats to take control to keep control of the House. And most people believe that probably 95% chance that Republicans will gain control of the House of Representatives. Also, there would be leadership changes. Congressman Pelosi, Hoyer, and Clyburn of the Democrats would lose their leadership positions and Speaker of the House. to Congressman McCarthy, Scalise, and Stefanik. So those would be big changes in the sense of the direction of issues that would be considered in the House. Also, if Republicans take control of the House, there would be probably a total change in the Democratic leadership. Most people believe that if Republicans took control, that Speaker of the House Pelosi, Hoyer, and Clyburn probably would not be in leadership anymore. There would be wholesale changes on the Democratic Party in regards to their leadership in the House, even in the minority. In regards to committee changes, these are where you're going to see huge changes in regards to the membership of those committees. In the Energy and Commerce Committee, if Republicans took control, Representative Kathy McMorris Rodgers would become the new chair instead of Representative Frank Pallone of New Jersey. Also, Brett Guthrie would be the Health Subcommittee chairman. He's a Republican from Kentucky, and instead of Representative Anna Issue of Congress. Where you're going to see, besides the change of the chairmanships, you will also see a huge change in the sense of who's on the committee. The current ratio on that committee is 32 Democrats to 23 Republicans. We already know that 7 Democrats and 5 Republicans are leaving because of retirements. And so in regards to that, you see that Republicans will add more people to their committee, but it's also a chance that they might even cut the total number of members on that committee. If that is the case, Democrats would have to lose even more seats on that committee, which means that some of the people who are currently on that committee, even though they win their election, they might be kicked off the Energy and Commerce Committee. On the Ways and Means Committee, there's a likelihood that Congressman Vern Buchanan could become chair. There's also Adrian Smith could become chair of Nebraska, and also Jason Smith of Missouri. It's a tough race to call right now, but most people believe that Vern Buchanan is in the lead. And then a subcommittee chair would probably be either Adrian Smith or Jason Smith, who would be in charge of the health subcommittee. Same thing as I mentioned in the Energy and Commerce Committee, there's not many people who would be leaving the committee because of retirements. So it is also a chance that if Republicans took control of the House, that additional Democrats would have to be kicked off the committee to fit the ratios on that on the Committee on Ways and Means. So as we've always said in the past, it's important to build relationships with all members of Congress, because after elections, there's a possibility that someone who's not on the healthcare committee could get on a health committee in the future after an election. Also, I want to mention there are PTs running for state legislature. As you can see, there are 7 current state reps and state senators who are physical therapists who are running again and for their seats. Also, there are 3 PT candidates running for the first time for state rep seats. Ben Massey Jr. Is running for a Democrat seat in North Carolina, Deb Lavender, a Democrat in Missouri, and Ken Closton, a Republican in Wyoming. So we could add 3 new members to the state legislatures representing the physical therapy profession as physical therapists. That is a snapshot of what could happen in the election, and also how that could affect the committees of jurisdiction regarding healthcare issues. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Kate Gillard, to talk about the Medicare Physician Fee Schedule.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I would like to talk to you guys about what we expect to see in the 2023 final rule on the physician fee schedule. So like Mike did, I want to give you a little bit of a prediction on when we might see the rule and what's going to be in it. So first of all, when are we going to see the fee schedule? It's important to know that right now, the 2023 final rule is sitting with the Office of Management and Budget. Now, that's an office located in as part of the White House, and it's sort of the final stop that a rule makes before it's released to the public. You can see there on your screen a screenshot of OMB's regulatory dashboard, where you can see all the hundreds of rules that they're reviewing at any given time. And you can see that the fee schedule has been there since September 21st. Now, it's harder to predict how long it takes a rule to be reviewed by OMB, but we do expect the rule to come out at the tail end of October. So the next thing we want to talk about is what's actually in the rule and how we think the final rule will land on important policy issues. So the first issue, and probably the one you all are most familiar with, is the issue of the conversion factor. Now, we all know that the proposed rule included a negative 4.42% reduction to the conversion factor, which affects payment to all services under the fee schedule. Those of you who have been following along for some time know that this has become an annual issue with the rule, and it is very unlikely that CMS is going to change their policy position on this issue just because of how deep we are many years into this policy. In the past few years, we have been able to get congressional intervention in order to avert cuts. And Justin will give you an update on the congressional side of things in just a moment. But in terms of regulatory relief, we don't expect CMS to change this policy. Moving on to the Medicare Economic Index policy, this is a pretty nerdy regulatory policy that would essentially change the way CPT codes are weighted. So we know right now that CPT codes consist of work, practice expense, and malpractice RVUs. Now, how each one of those values is weighted in relation to the others is determined by the Medicare Economic Index. And CMS is proposing to update. And in their proposed rule, they think that this would result in a 2% increase to payment for PT/OT services, which would be great, of course. But we had some questions to look for in the final rule in terms of how this policy is going to affect MPPR, which is always in play when practice expense changes, as well as how long it will take CMS to phase in this policy. But we do think overall it will be a beneficial impact. Moving on to remote therapeutic monitoring codes, CMS has really been grappling with these codes for a couple years now. We saw in the rule this year, CMS continuing to struggle with questions about incident to billing that led them to remove the practice expense from RTM codes that physical therapists and physical therapist assistants can bill. We submitted comments in opposition to this policy and also pointed out some issues with the data limits they impose on these codes. Now, we have a lot of allies in this fight. There are a lot of companies that have a vested interest in remote therapeutic monitoring, and they are on our side in this fight as well. Also, given the fact that we were able to convince CMS to change their mind on remote therapeutic monitoring codes last year, we think it's very likely that they will turn around on these codes and we will have a beneficial result in the final rule. Last big issue is PTA supervision. Now, I want to make it clear that changing supervision for PTAs from direct to general was not in the proposed rule. And that means CMS is unable to make that change in the final rule. So what was at stake was direct supervision through virtual presence, a flexibility that's been allowed during the public health emergency. CMS in the proposed rule asked about specific instances or scenarios where they would make this flexibility permanent. We responded that although we believe general supervision is the standard CMS should implement, direct supervision through virtual presence would be certainly better than direct supervision, keeping in mind that direct supervision through virtual presence is very similar to general supervision in that you only have to be available via a audio-visual call or real-time audio telecommunications as opposed to being physically on site as required through direct supervision. So we don't think CMS is actually going to make this policy move for PTAs because it seemed very clear in the proposed rule that they were thinking about different scenarios in terms of administering drugs and things like that. However, again, we have congressional action on this issue that Justin will speak about in just a minute. So these four issues aren't the only things in the rule. There are actually quite a number of things we'll be looking for in the final rule, including the issues you see on your screen. Other things to look for include MIPS changes. CMS is considering making physical therapists report the promoting interoperability category, which will require the use of certified electronic health records technology, which is very difficult to obtain. We're also looking for CMS to potentially add more of our CPT codes to the telehealth list, which would allow us to practice telehealth under Medicare, assuming legislation was passed making us permanently authorized providers of telehealth services. We also saw a very interesting opportunity to submit comments this year on underutilized services that CMS already covers, but if covered more, could result in lower costs for the program. We submitted quite lengthy comments on all of the different ways, all of the different patients, and all of the different conditions that physical therapists can treat, but sometimes aren't always thought of, and how increasing access to PT services will save the Medicare system money. We also saw new chronic pain codes proposed in the proposed rule, and we are waiting for some key answers from CMS on exactly if and how physical therapists can be involved in billing those codes or as part of the comprehensive team that would manage chronic pain. And then finally, there were some specific caregiver training codes for behavioral health, which, while not applicable to physical therapy, are kind of going to set the precedent for caregiver training codes in the future. And we just recently developed some caregiver training codes for physical therapy. So using these caregiver training codes as a predictor of the future will determine whether or not our new codes are likely to be covered in next year's Medicare Physician Fee Schedule. So lots to look for in the final rule that we hope will be coming out at the end of October. Obviously, APTA will issue a robust summary of the final rule so you all know what you need to know. But with that, I will now pass it over to Justin Elliott for the fall congressional calendar.
All right, thanks, Kate. Well, here we are, the final 3 months of the 117th Congress. Congress is on their fall break right now and won't be back in D.C. until after the November midterm elections, which Mike Matlack presented on. And as Mike noted, this is going to be a very close midterm election. Now, those elections, the results of those midterm elections will have a major impact on what Congress does or does not do during its lame duck session. That, of course, is the session that they will do when they come back in November. And it's important to note that they will have a year's worth of work to do in only 3 weeks. And Congress will be working to put together a year-end package. And the question is, what will or won't be included in that year-end package? And of course, APTA is advocating for inclusion of a number of our priority bills to be included in that legislation. But first, before we talk about some of the bills that are in play for the end of the year, it should be noted 3 bills that have been enacted. Of course, we started ended last year, started off this year with the thanks to APTA member advocates and a broad coalition of a variety of providers. We saw Congress enact legislation providing over $3 billion in new funding to the 2022 Medicare Fee Schedule. That, of course, mitigated plan cuts for 2022. Soon thereafter, we saw enactment of the APTA-supported bill, the Dr. Lorna Breen Healthcare Providers Protection Act, which is aimed at addressing provider burnout and mental health. And earlier this spring, we saw legislation enacted through the Consolidated Appropriations Act, language included in that bill supported by APTA that would ensure that PTs, PTAs, and other therapy providers will have at least a 5-month or 151-day extension on the current ability to utilize telehealth that has been granted due to the public health emergency. But that's not all that's going on. Obviously, we have a number of bills, and I'm going to quickly go through what are some of the bills that we are working on. Of course, this summer we saw, speaking of telehealth, is HR 4040. This legislation, instead of having a 5-month extension, would expand that to a full 2 years through the end of 2024, the ability of therapists to continue to utilize telehealth. And just a few weeks ago, we saw the House of Representatives overwhelmingly pass the Improving Seniors Timely Access to Care Act. This legislation, of course, would address the use of prior authorization under Medicare Advantage plans. And we can go to the next slide. Of course, that bill now awaits action in the United States Senate. Of course, another APTA priority bill is the Allied Health Workforce Diversity Act. This is legislation aimed at supporting APTA's DE&I initiatives, as well as addressing the issue of student loans. And this legislation has passed the powerful House Energy and Commerce Committee. And on the Senate side, we saw the Senate companion to the Allied Health Workforce Diversity Act get included and wrapped into a bill called the Prevent Pandemics Act. The Prevent Pandemics Act was then passed by the Senate Help Committee. And so the question is, will the Allied Health Bill or the Prevent Pandemics Act be included in any year-end package? In addition, it should be noted that the advocacy efforts aimed at supporting PTs and PTAs who work in the Veterans Administration. And APTA was successful in getting language added to the Veterans Affairs Appropriations legislation that would expand the role of both PTs and PTAs in the VA. And that includes everything from looking at ways to increase payment for therapists, as well as providing scholarship opportunities, and as well as expanding the role of PTs in primary care in the VA. A couple other bills just to quickly talk about. We have obviously the legislation that would add physical therapists to the National Health Service Corps loan repayment program. We're up to 66 co-sponsors now in the House, 5 in the Senate. We have legislation, of course, that would permanently make PTs and PTAs approved and providers of telehealth under Medicare. Legislation to expand the use of PT locum tenens. And folks may recall that back in 2016, APTA was successful in getting legislation that allows PTs to use locum tenens in rural and underserved areas. This legislation would expand it to be nationwide. Of course, APTA supports legislation that would require Congress to meet the promise that they made when they passed the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and that is to provide full funding to the IDEA. A number of bills also that are addressing a variety of issues. The Preserving Access to Home Health Act. This is legislation that would prevent proposed cuts to home health services under Medicare. Of course, we have legislation dealing with long COVID, as well as legislation, the Primary Health Services Enhancement Act, that would add physical therapists as providers under community health centers. And a new bill that came out late this summer was the Optimizing Postpartum Outcomes Act. This legislation would expand the role of pelvic physical therapy under state Medicaid programs and CHIP programs. Of course, the two big bills will be that is getting a lot of attention, of course, is, as Kate mentioned, once again, dozens of providers are facing cuts under the 2023 Medicare fee schedule. And once again, we need Congress to intervene to mitigate and prevent those cuts. Now, we've been successful the last 2 years in getting Congress to add billions of dollars in new funding to the fee schedule to mitigate the impact of those cuts. But once again, we need them to intervene before the end of this year to do that once again. And of course, we have a bill in the House, H.R. 8800, introduced by Congressman Ami Bera from California, Congressman Larry Bouchon from Indiana. This legislation, if enacted, would provide additional new funding to the 2023 Medicare fee schedule to address the impact of those proposed cuts. But it would also set the table for Congress to begin doing some long-term reforms to the Medicare fee schedule. It includes language that is what's known as the sense of Congress language that really says that it's time for Congress to start working on reforms to the fee schedule to provide stability for providers, access for patients, and to address administrative burden issues. So be on the lookout for this legislation to begin really heating up in the weeks ahead. And of course, the SMART Act, H.R. 5536, introduced by Congressman Bobby Rush and Congressman Jason Smith. This bipartisan legislation would address the impact of the PTA and OTA payment differential, which was enacted on January 1st of this year. And of course, the big thing that this legislation would also do would mandate CMS change the current burdensome and outdated direct supervision requirement to general supervision. And so that legislation, we are anticipating a Senate companion to be introduced any day now. And that will, of course, both of these bills, you'll see a lot of advocacy opportunities as we push Congress to include both of these bills, as well as all the other bills I just talked about in the year-end package. But those are just a quick look at just some, but not all of the bills APTA is advocating on, and that we're working to get over the line before Congress adjourns at the end of this year. So do stay tuned for additional updates and advocacy opportunities to support these bills in the weeks ahead. As always, thank you for your advocacy. Thank you for your support of the PT profession. And thank you for being members of APTA.